Hi everyone, and thanks so much for joining today. I'm really excited for this demo as I'm going to be showing you how to go from a new blank Katana script all the way through to lighting and rendering an entire sequence of multiple shots. During the presentation, I'm going to be taking you through some new features that have been developed for Katana 4.5 and 5 and show you how these tools can really help to speed up your workflows while allowing you the creative freedom that you need as artists. So let's get started. I'm going to be working with USD assets in this demo. So I'm going to place down a USD in node to bring in the sequence. I could set up a variable switch and plug in a USD in for each shot, or we can use an expression to bring in our entire sequence of multiple shots using just this one node. This has been made even easier than before with the addition of the getVar syntax in Katana 4.5 and 5. And this syntax relies on graph state variables being set up. So let's do that now. I'm going to jump into the project settings tab and add a graph state variable named shot. I'm then going to add each shot for the sequence. In this case, there's 9. And I'm making sure that these numbers correspond to the shot numbers that are used in the USD file names. And once this is done, we can see that these are all selectable from the variables drop-down at the top. So now in the USD parameters, I can write an expression that will load a shot based on which shot variation is selected. So I'll access the project directory, which in this case is the same as where each shot USD file lives. And the naming convention of these files is shot_C008 for sequence 8, _S for shot. And after this, we want to grab the shot number from the variable. So we can use getVar, and then the variable is called shot, and add the file extension, which is USDA. So now we have an expression that's reading a shot based on the selected variable. And this method is really efficient as we're using just one node to load the entire sequence, including the geometry, animation, and cameras. And as you can see, as I switch between the different shots, the scene graph updates. So we've done all this through just that one node and a graph state variable. And you can imagine if we have multiple sequences, it would be really easy to switch them out, as long as those naming conventions remain the same. If you take a look in the scene graph, you can see that all the materials have also been brought in. And if I select a piece of geometry and look in the attributes, then you can see that the assignments have all been brought in as well. And just to demonstrate this, I'll quickly switch on the PureMan render delegate in the viewer. And switch off the basic materials. And then you can see all the objects have their materials. These render delegates are another new addition to Katana 4.5 and 5, and they just provide you with a really quick and easy way of viewing your scene without having to set up lights and render settings and performing a render. The render delegates work by adding a bridge between the viewer and the renderer. I'm going to switch the render delegate off for now while I set some more of the scene up. So this sequence contains some characters that all have hair. As you can see in the viewer, they're all bold at the moment. So I'm going to bring in a live group that has been created to set up the XGen files. And if we take a look inside this live group, you can see that there's a group for each character. And these groups each contain a render procedural, the XGen paths, and a couple of op scripts for setting the palette, the description, and the patch, as well as some other parameters that are required for getting XGen working. So Before going any further, I'm going to add some render nodes so that I can get a live render running to show you how this sequence can be lit and rendered really, really fast. And using these nodes, I'm just setting the render camera and the camera settings, setting a pixel path tracer integrator, setting the resolution, samples, and some global settings. I'm using RenderMan, so some of these nodes will be RenderMan specific, but their equivalents are available for whichever renderer you use. I'm also going to set up some collections for certain elements in the scene, and I'll store them in a group stack for the purpose of organization. So here I'm setting up a collection for the props by calling all items in the scene graph under root world geo whose name begins with the word prop. And as you can see, when I make this selection in the scene graph, the correct items are being selected. So I'm going to repeat this for the environment, characters, both separate and all together, and then one collection for the glass elements. I'm going to also create a collection that holds all the props, environments, and characters all together. And then I'll set some optimization collections, which will include anything that's not included in each shot. These collections specifically will make it really quick and easy when it comes to optimizing the shots, which I'll show you in the next step. So I've sped up this initial setup as there's a lot of repetition when I'm just creating the collections. So now that they're set up, I can use these collections within a prune node to remove these elements on a per shot basis by referencing the collection and then the shot variable. So as I switch between my different shots, a different collection would be referenced in. And next I'm going to add some PRMan object statements to apply a displacement bound for all the geometry. And increase the trace depth for the glass objects in particular. I'm also going to set the orientation for all polymesh and sub-D-mesh objects. And just before we set off a render and start on the lighting, I'm going to show you a really useful method for optimizing your scene in Katana even further. We're going to use interactive render filters for this. And this node lets you create global changes for preview and live renders, so you can add nodes and make overrides without having to connect them to your node network at all. And these interactive render filters can then be selected based on your needs at that time. So I'm going to set one up to reduce the render image size by using a render settings node to reduce the resolution to 640 by 360. And now I'll be able to add and clear this render filter whenever it's needed. I'm also going to set up some other render filters, including pruning the groom, isolating the main character, turning the displacement off, and some others which will help to reduce render times and let me work more quickly. And I'm just going to speed this up as the process is very similar for all of these render filters. So now that these are all set up, I don't need to activate them all at the same time, but they're available for when I need to use them. For example, a lighting artist may want to work with low-res renders and may not need the displacement or the groom to be turned on straight away. So being able to have control over these settings can really help to speed up your workflow. So for now, I'm going to use the filters that switch off the displacement and reduce my resolution just to speed up the live renders as I start lighting the scene. So now that I've done the initial setup and optimization, I'm going to start lighting the scene by adding a render node and Gaffer 3. And then I'll set off a live render for just shot 10. I'm going to send the renders to the Katana queue, which is Katana's simple queuing mechanism for local renders. It's expected at this point that the render will come out black, as there's no lights in the scene yet. So I can jump full screen into the viewer, activate the lighting tools, choose a light from the drop down, and then I can really quickly and easily start clicking to place lights in the scene. And these lights are being placed in relation to the object's normal. So in this case, I want to focus on lighting the character here, and I can scale them, move them closer and further from the character. And as well as this, I can access some of the light parameters in this floating widget. So I can increase the exposure and add more of a warm orange color to the light. This is a really good way to start building up the lights in a shot. But I have a whole sequence to light, so I can set off some more live renders for a couple of other shots. And I know that shots 14 and 15 have quite different camera angles from each other, and also from shot 10. So I'm going to start with them. I'm choosing not to set off more live renders than this initially, so that I can work efficiently in this early stage, and then I can bring in more shots and refine the lighting later on. So while these renders get started, I'm going to change my layout just a little bit to make it more suitable for lighting. I'm going to dock the catalog tab on the left so that it stays visible even when I jump full screen into the viewer. And this is going to really help because I want to be able to see all my shots as I'm working on the lighting. Okay, so now I have the layout set up the way that I want it. I can jump into perspective view and start positioning the lights. So the light that I've already created is going to be the sunlight coming through the window. So I'll push it out past the window. And I'll just scale it up and move it around so that it's coming straight through the window. So as I'm moving it around, we can see the live renders are updating nicely. And this really helps to make sure that this lighting is looking exactly how I want it across all the shots, rather than just working on one. I'll move it back and increase the exposure, and just get it to the point where I think it's starting to look pretty good. I'm happy with this one, and I'm going to add a new light. I'm still using the normal light placement option to place this light. So as I move it around, I can aim it at other objects if I want to. But as well as this, I can use the more traditional ways of placing lights by looking through the light itself. And I choose these different methods depending on the situation. So, for example, in this case, I want to make sure that the light is positioned directly behind the window. And I don't necessarily want to light a specific object in the room, as this light is going to be my skylight. So I'm going to give it a slightly blue tint as well. And as I'm making edits to the lights, you can see that when I select these lights in the viewer, none of the geometry is actually being selected. And this is because when the lighting tools are active, you're only able to select lights in the viewer. So none of the geometry is selectable, which prevents you from accidentally making geometry selections and just allows you to work that much more quickly. So I'm going to make some more small refinements to these lights, making sure that the colors are looking right, until I get something that I'm fairly happy with. And now I'm going to add one more light, which is going to be the fill light for this scene. And to do this, I'm going to use the camera position button, which is part of the lighting tools toolset. And this allows me to place the light at the position of the camera, which gives me a huge amount of control over where I want that light to go. And then I'll increase the exposure, change the color slightly to make it a bit warmer. And I think this is starting to look nice. So I'm just going to quickly jump back into the parameters for the lights and change their names. And then I'm also going to go into the advanced material parameters and assign them to a light group. And doing this will just make it much easier when I set up my AOVs later on in the session. While I'm doing this, I'm also going to give my Gaffer 3 node a name as well. And then I'm going to add a new Gaffer 3 for my kitchen lights. So the kitchen is only visible in the background of shot 10, but I still want to add some light here. And as you can see, when we jump back into the viewer, you can now switch between the different Gaffer 3 nodes. And the symbol will tell you whether the selected lights are editable from this level. So I'll jump back to the sequence lounge lighting. And then I can make some changes to the lights at this level. And when I'm happy with the changes that I've made, I'll go into the sequence kitchen lighting, and I can start placing lights here as well. So I'll just quickly expand the scene graph out so that all of our props and characters are visible here. And for the kitchen, I want to create some sunlight coming through this window. And what I can do instead of setting up another light from scratch is clone the sunlight that we already have set up for the lounge. So I can select this sunlight and then use the clone option in the lighting tools. And then when I click to place a light, I'm going to be placing a clone of the selected light. This is another placement option, which makes it really quick and easy to make duplications of lights. There is also a clone as template option for setting up template materials. However, I want to be able to make individual changes to the sunlight coming through the kitchen and the sunlight coming through the lounge. So I'm just going to leave it as a clone for now. And now, as you can see, as the renders update, you'll see shot 10, the kitchen is lit nicely in the background. And I think this is all the shot really needs just to bring some light into it. So I'll make a few more small changes. And then the last thing I'm going to do for now is to just add a RenderMan light filter. And I'm going to choose a barn light filter linked to the sunlight for the lounge. And this is just going to cast a nice window shape onto the rug. So I'm feeling quite happy with the sequence lighting for my shots, and now I can go in and make some per camera angle and per shot changes to this lighting. To do this, I'm going to use a variable switch node and reference the shot variable that we already have set up. Now, in the inputs, I'm going to group the shots together based on similar camera angles. None of them have exactly the same camera angles, but they're close enough that I would want the same lighting override at this level. And I can then go in at a later time and make pair shot overrides as well. So I'm going to add a Gaffer 3 node and inherit the lights from the incoming scene, which will allow me to see the lights that I've created in upstream Gaffer 3s. And then I'll adopt the lights for editing so I can edit them from within this Gaffer 3. And now I can start making some changes. If I look at my renders, shot 10 is looking quite a lot brighter than the other shots. So I'm just going to bring the exposure down a little bit. And as you can see, when I'm doing this, only shot 10 is updating in the live render. And this functionality is part of the Foresight+ work introduced in Katana 4.5 and 5. And this means that an update will only be triggered in a live render when changes are made that directly affect that render. So because I'm making a change to the lighting that affects shot 10, the other renders don't update, which allows me to work so much more efficiently. Another new addition brought in with Foresight+ is the ability to pin attributes in the catalogue. As you can see, if I open up the catalogue tab a little bit more, we have different columns with different attributes about each render from this session. So I'm going to quickly click and drag to move these around, just to organize them a little bit better, and keep the ones that I really care about seeing at the front. So these tick boxes indicate a pinned attribute, which means that when changes are made to these, a live render won't be triggered until they're unpinned. For example, we have a global tick box and one for the frame. So if I scroll through the timeline and switch between different shots, live renders won't update because these attributes are pinned. If I unpin these attributes, then the render will update. So I'll untick both the frame and the shot, and you can see that now this render is updating. And if I just unpin the frame and scrub through the timeline, then the render will update accordingly. This is really useful as it allows you to have full control over what triggers that live render to update and what doesn't. Another addition brought in with Foresight+ is the Sync to Project Settings tick box. And when this is enabled, all your global settings will update based on which catalogue entry is in the foreground. So as you can see, as I'm switching between them in the catalogue, my scene graph, the frame, and graph state variables are all updating, so you can work in the context of your renders. These new Foresight+ tools allow artists to work with a lot more control and efficiency. So I'm going to go back to the node graph and just add a few more Gaffer 3 nodes in between each of these streams, and I'm going to make some changes to some of the other shots. So in this case, the shots that are being affected include shot 40 and 14. So as I make changes here, you'll see two of my renders are updating. The aim of these overrides is to really get my lighting to look consistent across all these shots. So in certain shots, some lights might look too bright, whereas in other shots, they might not look bright enough. And we can then go down another level and add a variable enabled group with a Gaffer 3 inside. I can reference the shot variable and a specific shot, and by doing this, only the shots that I've referenced will be affected by the nodes inside this variable enabled group. So I can now go in and make changes to particular shots and make even more refined edits on a both per shot and per camera angle basis. Remember, you can always add other shots to the existing variable switch and variable enable group nodes, and then all the affected renders will be triggered with the updates. These overrides can be set up in whichever way you find most useful. In production, it's fairly common for different artists to have control over different parts of the lighting, for example, the sequence lighting and any individual shot lighting. These could then be divided up using live groups. So I'm going to leave the lighting here and just talk a little bit about variants. So there's a few material variations that have been brought in with the USD files in the sequence. I know that we have some shirt variants that have been set up for our hero character Joao, and we can access and switch between these using a USD in variant select node. So I'll place one down, but first I'm just going to cancel the live renders for now while I get this set up. So I'll place the USD in variant select, and then I'm just going to change my layout again as I need to access the scene graph and I don't really need the catalog docked anymore. And now I can drag the Joao character from the scene graph to the location field. And then we should be able to select the shirt type variant, which would have been written out with the USD material bakes, and choose each variant from the drop-down. I'm going to start a live render quickly so that we can see these different variants as I switch between them. So as you can see, as I'm switching between these different variations, the live render updates. I'm just going to quickly unpin the frame for this render so that I can see if there's a frame in this shot where his shirt is more visible. But it doesn't look like there is, so that's fine, we can see this well enough here. So we can use this node to switch between these variations, but a more efficient way of doing this would be to link them to a graph state variable in the same way that we did with the shots. And this also avoids using multiple USD and variant select nodes and another variable switch. So first I'll need to add a graph state variable, this one for Joao's shirt type. And I'll add the variations here as well, remembering to keep the name the same as the variants, just like we did before. So now that I have this set up, we can use an expression in the variant selection field to grab the name from the graph state variable selection. So as I switch between the graph state variable states, the variant select is grabbing the name and inputting it here. And in the live render, you can see the shirt type update. As many variations as needed can be set up in the same way, including geometry variants for different style of objects. And this gives you a lot of freedom and makes it really easy to make these changes, even at this stage in the pipeline. As well as accessing these existing variants, we may also want to make changes to any of the materials in the scene. And because the materials have all been brought in with USD files, we can make edits really easily using a network material edit node. For example, I might want the wood of the TV unit to be a little darker. I'll just need to reference the material that I want to change. So the TV unit matte. So I'll set a couple more renders off so that I can see these changes across a few different shots. And I can jump in and make changes by adding, removing, or editing existing nodes, and the changes are reflected in the live render. So here I'll open a color correct node that already exists in the node graph, and I'll just lower the exposure a little bit to make the wood of the TV unit a little bit darker. And you'll see that the node is now marked with a yellow stripe, and this indicates an edit. So once I've made this change, you can see that the live render is updating, and I can now jump into the Monitor tab and compare the live render with a previous render from my catalog. I can use the multi-view options like the horizontal split or the swipe line to compare between the two as I'm making changes. The Monitor and Catalog tab have been designed to be used in unison, so you can really easily compare your current and previous renders to help with the iterative process. One of the benefits of using a network material edit node for this is that you can plug them into the per shot or per camera angle overrides to make changes on a per shot basis. For example, this might look a little bit too dark in some of the shots, so we can have full control over which shots are actually being affected by this network material edit, either by plugging it into an existing stream that we already have set up, or by creating new variable enable groups and specifying exactly what shots we want to be affected. Another benefit is that these changes are all stored in this one node, so they can be really easily disabled and enabled if you wanted to revert back to the original. And if needed, you can also set up material variations using a network material edit and create a new graph state variable to switch between them. So I'm going to quickly tidy up my node graph by grouping the Gaffer 3 nodes and lighting setup, and by adding some backdrops. So I think the sequence is starting to look really nice so far, but there's still a lot that I could do to enhance the overall appearance. For example, volumes are a really quick and simple way of bringing atmosphere and depth to your scene. So I'm going to add a PRMan volume node. I'll just cancel my live renders while I do this. And then I'm going to scale it up so that it surrounds the lounge and the kitchen. Then I'm going to add a primvar to set the density. And now I can set off some live renders again so that I can see what this is all looking like. I'll set off some renders for shots 50 and 51, as shot 50 has all 3 characters and almost the whole lounge, and shot 51 is more of a close-up of just Joao. So I want to make sure that it looks right for both of these. The renders are going to be black as I haven't assigned a material, and the density is probably going to be too high right now. So I'll create and assign a pixel volume material. and give it a nice warm orangey color to tie it in with the sunlight streaming in the windows. And then I can bring that density down until it starts to look nice within these shots. That's still a bit high, so bring it down a little bit more. And that's looking good. So I'm feeling really happy with the shots as they're looking now. I'm going to stop the live renders and set off a quick preview render for all of these shots, just to check consistency across the whole sequence. For these renders, I'll turn groom and displacement on and increase the resolution slightly. And you can see in the dialog that we now have options for the shirt type. So if you wanted to, you could set off some renders to test the different variations across all the shots. But I'm just going to pick one and start the renders. And I'm pretty happy with how they're all looking at this point. Remember, I can always go back and make some more changes to any of these nodes, the gaffer setups, the materials, the volume, and so on. But for now, I'm going to go with these renders we have. So we've got one for each shot, and the scene is pretty much set up. As I said, we can go back and make edits if needed, but we've got to a good stage where we could really benefit from viewing our renders in the context of a Nuke composite that we know will be applied to the final renders in some form. And this can be done using the Nuke bridge. Before I show you this, I'm going to set up some render layers that we can utilize through the Nuke bridge. We can do this really easily by adding multiple render nodes and object statements to map certain elements. So I'm going to add one here for the environment. So I'll mat out all the characters. I'm also creating these render layers in the same way for each character and the volumes, as well as a couple for the entire scene, one with and one without volumetrics. I'll speed this up as the process for creating these layers is pretty similar for each one. To set these up, I'm just referencing the collections that we made before. For example, to mat everything but our Joao character, I can reference the environment, the prop, and the characters minus Joao. I'm also going to add some render passes for the diffuse and specular, Z-depth, and each light type. I'm using light path expressions here to define the AOVs, and I'm grouping the lights by the light groups that we set up in the parameters earlier. Again, I'm speeding this all up as it's a repetitive process, but I'm adding a PRMan output channel define and a render output define for each of these channels. So now let's jump into the exciting part, which is the Nuke bridge. This is another new addition to Katana 4.5 and 5 and a really exciting feature, which allows us to stream renders to Nuke from Katana, perform a compositing process, and then stream the results back to Katana to be viewed. This is a hugely powerful feature for Katana, and it provides artists with the ability to work in the context of the final result and reduces the need to re-render. So I have a Nuke script set up with a simple compositing process that will apply a grade, and I'm going to load that script in the Nuke Bridge tab. The mapping inputs are read automatically from the Katana Reader and Katana Writer nodes inside the Nuke script, and these are new Nuke nodes that have been created specifically for streaming between Nuke and Katana. You can select catalog entries for each of these inputs. So I've just got one in this example. And then the Katana Writer node determines the result that's streamed back into Katana. So we can perform preview and live comps from here and choose where they get sent to. So for example, I can set off a preview render, and the result that comes back has been streamed back from Nuke, so I can make even more precise and informed changes as the image that I'm seeing is closer to the final result than ever before. I can then use the monitor to view this comp and compare it to the original render to get a really clear comparison between the two. The Nuke Bridge is a really powerful addition to Katana 4.5 and 5, as it allows for more effective collaboration and communication between the lighting and the compositing. Another really great thing about the Nuke Bridge is that Nuke doesn't even have to be open. As you may have noticed, it can be run in headless mode, so you can really remain focused inside Katana while streaming back and forth from Nuke. I'm going to load a different script just to show you. This one has two inputs, so we can comp our volumetrics with the rest of the shot, and I'll just load another. This one takes 5 inputs, one for each element in the scene, so they can be comped together and then streamed back. I'll demonstrate this, so I'm going to set off a render for each of these layers that we need. And when they're done, I'll select the catalog entries for the relevant inputs and then set off a preview comp. And you can see in the result that all these elements have now been comped together and a grade and a glow have been applied. This is great, but we may want to view or make some changes to the Nuke script itself. So to do this, we can just run an interactive comp, and that will launch Nuke so you can make adjustments. And these adjustments are applied to the image in Katana. We have two outputs in this script, as you can see, a comp and a context sheet. If I jump back to Katana, you can see that they're both selectable here. We can also compare our current interactive comp to the previous preview comp that we set off in the same way as before by using the multi-view in the monitor. So we can always see exactly what our changes look like. This whole workflow between Katana and Nuke allows for really smooth iterations and lets you work on a more final version of your shot or sequence. So it's taken us roughly 1 hour, or just under an hour, to go from a blank Katana project to a complete scene set up with multiple shots. We've lit and rendered the entire sequence and streamed to Nuke to apply a comp. We can then use this template that we've set up for multiple other sequences in this project or even other projects. The new features of Katana 4.5 and 5 have really helped to improve this workflow and make artists' lives much easier. Thank you everyone so much for watching. I really hope that you found this presentation valuable. If you're interested in trialing Katana, then you can head to foundry.com and start a 30-day free trial. You can get started with our learning content at learn.foundry.com/Katana.